Good evening, everyone. Today we're joined here for the Special Committee on Health, Opportunity, Prosperity, and Education, also known as H.O.P.E Committee, for a regular meeting for Monday, March 2nd, 2026. Madam Clerk, if you could please call the roll.
Chairman Pichardo,
Present.
Vice Chairwoman Peterson. Present. Councilor Andoval is absent. Councilor Royes.
Present.
Councilor Sanchez. Present. 4 present, 1 absent. You have a quorum.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. For the purpose of this meeting, we're going to have just 2 presenters today and also have some deliberation among this committee. We will also be sharing with you some additional dates that we will continue to have regarding the rent stabilization ordinance. In addition to, the public will also have an opportunity to provide public testimony on any suggested amendments that we have for this ordinance. At this time, Madam Clerk, if you could read item number 1.
Item 1, an ordinance amending Chapter 13, Housing of the Code of Ordinances of the City of Providence to add the next appropriate article, the Providence Rent Stabilization Act.
Thank you very much. I also would like to recognize that are present with us, colleagues, Chairwoman Mary Kay Harris from Ward 11, and also our colleague from Ward 2, Jill Davison, and of course our President, Rachel Miller. Thank you for joining us. At this time, we'd like to have the sponsor of the bill, Council President Rachel Miller. If you'd like to, thank you.
All right.
Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman and committee members. And I really do want to thank you for taking this up tonight, for having nearly 6 hours, 5.5 at least hours of testimony at the public hearing. There's been many other hours of community meetings and more to come. So I just want to very earnestly thank you for the deliberation and the kind of trust that you are putting in the people of Providence to come and share their experiences and voices. So thank you for that. I have been thinking about how to move rent stabilization in Providence for as long as I've been in office. So it's been 7 years now. In that 7 years, rent has risen dramatically. In the last couple of years, an average of 16%, but long before that, right? Rent was, felt like we were at a high 7 years ago. We have far surpassed that. Families who were longtime Providence families have left our city in the time that I've been in office. And it's hard to share the kind of policy failure that feels like, right? To have done nothing to stall huge rent increases in my time, almost 2 full terms, but 1 term and 3/4. And so I'm really glad that we're here. I'm proud of the ordinance before you. I think it represents some of the best things that have happened around the country in policies like this, and also has made adjustments that are specific to Providence, that are specific to our rental market. We heard so much testimony, and I know there'll be a lot of feedback and amendments that come from that testimony, but I just want to kind of ground us in the why of this proposal, and then as you get into discussion, if there's anything that I can add in terms of the mechanics of the ordinance later, I'm happy to do that. But, you know, I think one thing that I just want to remind people, rent stabilization does exactly one thing and one thing only. It stabilizes rent. It makes rent predictable. It helps families plan. It is not meant to do anything else. And so we are, as this council, we have done a tremendous amount of other things related to increasing housing in the city of Providence. We have overhauled the comprehensive plan, changing zoning, adding more density, adding accessory dwelling units. We have added money into the Housing Trust Fund and made sure that that money was for low-income residents specifically. We have subsidized private development through tax stabilization agreements, and we have banned algorithmic pricing that does get a little bit into rent prices. But all of that is increasing the housing stock in ways that we need to do and will keep doing. What we are doing right now is recognizing that we cannot wait, the people of Providence cannot wait for a market to correct itself. In fact, the situation that we're in today is the result of the market, is a result of market forces. So we know that it's a situation that's just untenable. And then I just want to speak a little bit to what we kind of heard in committee and share some thoughts on, in the public hearing, and share some thoughts. So people often cite data and studies as if they are kind of sacrosanct. There's a couple things I just want to be absolutely clear on. There is no peer-reviewed study at all that shows that rent stabilization policies decrease construction. In fact, we have seen in Portland, Maine, most recently, that an increase in construction permits followed rent stabilization. Now, I don't think anyone would say, oh, that's because of rent stabilization, right? That is a correlation. Two things happened at once, and those things do not cause each other, right? It's that correlation, not causation. However, the thing that we know, if you talk to the people who do study this, if you talk to the people who do submit peer-reviewed articles on this topic, the thing that determines development, the thing that determines construction, is the desirability of the market. It is, by and large, not the regulation of that market. And so Rhode Island has a highly desirable market. Providence has a highly desirable market in any of the measures, right? And so I have shared in the past and can again, right, like how hot, which list we're topping on hot markets. That is a really important thing to keep in mind. There is no evidence that rent stabilization decreases construction. That is something worth saying over and over and over again. What we know that it does do is it increases long-term tenancy. It slows rent increases. And so, you know, you hear people say, oh, well, 4%, 4%, 4% every year, that's 20%. And it's true. In 5 years, that's 20%. That's 20% for a family that can plan a rent increase knowing that it might come over time, as opposed to being faced with a 20% rent increase with 30 or 60 days notice. That is a dramatically different situation. We're talking about how people live. And as a renter, frankly, how I live. It increases stability. It decreases the variability that we know has contributed to homelessness in Providence. We have seen more and more people living on the streets without a home. We know that the out-of-control rent prices are part of that story. And we know that it reduces rent in the long term, especially with the vacancy control aspect of it, right? So a lot of people talk about, oh, you know, I keep rent stable and then I flip it to market rate when it becomes open. And I think as much as, you know, I think we could talk about 4% keeping rent stable, or up to 4% increases keeping rent relatively stable. And then we could also talk about, okay, so there's a couple or a young family or an individual who's enjoying that stability while it lasts, And then all of a sudden, that apartment is no longer available to all of the people in that income bracket, which, by the way, in Providence, we know is most of us, right? And so when we're thinking about housing, we need to be thinking about what is a full community experience and the full community need. And then, you know, there's two other pieces, but the one thing that folks talked about a lot was this, oh, you know, it won't impact the people who need it. And that is not related to the policy that's in front of you. So the policy that in front of you is saying whatever the start rate of rent, whatever the starting price is, that's the price, right? There's the rent board that the policy creates does not tell you how much rent you can charge from the get, right? And so people who are in $2,300 a month apartments are gonna stay in a $2,300 a month apartment. They'll just know that it can't jump by 30% in the next year, only by 4. Yeah, so I think there's a lot more that we can get into, and I'm sure that we will. There's one thing that I think is so fundamental to what the policy in front of you does. There is nowhere in the state of Rhode Island and the city of Providence where someone who is a renter, who is talking about their whole lives, right, is talking about their family, their stability, their ability to sleep well in a bed at night. When something happens to that price of their rent, there is nowhere right now in the city for them to go and talk. There is nowhere. There's nowhere that people can speak to someone who has authority over the situation and say, yep, you know what? You ought not have to look at a rent increase that outprices you from the home that you live in. And the rent board will do that, right? It creates a fundamental shift in what is allowable for people who rent in the city of Providence. And then finally, you know, one thing that also came up pretty frequently in public testimony was, I understand that it's an issue, right? I understand that the rent increases are an issue, but why does it have to be mine? And I really hear that. I think it's also really important to think about that response, right? Because we're talking about folks who own property and are renting. The intent of this ordinance is to make sure that people can make a return on their investment, can cover costs, can keep buildings maintained. By the way, there's no studies show that buildings do remain maintained in cities with rent stabilization, right? That is not another fear point that comes up. But the reality is, as a property owner or as a renter, the conditions of housing and availability of housing is an issue for all of us, right? And so to sort of deny local government the ability to set some constraints on the amassing profit, right? That means that, oh yeah, local government just can't care about the people who live here, can't care about the market, can't care about the city. And I know that's not the case. I know that we do. I know that we cannot do nothing. I think that doing nothing specifically about the high cost of rent and the ability for rent to continue to skyrocket, doing nothing will be catastrophic, as it already has been for many, many residents. So thank you, and I'm of course happy to continue discussing over there from my seat. Thanks.
Thank you, Council President Miller, for that testimony, and I'm sure our committee will have some questions as we move forward. At this time, I'd like to call Larry Mancini, who is the Chief Financial for the City of Providence, and also I'd like to call Tom Sogoros. Yes, please.
please raise your right hand? Do you swear on the penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth?
I do.
Yes. Can you please state your name and title for the record?
Lawrence Mancini, Chief Financial Officer, City of Providence.
Tom Seguris, independent policy consultant.
Thank you. Welcome. You may sit.
Mr. Chairman, if you may, I think
Yes, please.
I had asked you earlier. Chief Operating Officer Courtney Hawkins had prepared a letter to the committee and had asked that, with your consent and the committee's consent, that I at least be permitted to submit it to the clerk or give a brief overview of her remarks before I give my own remarks. Would that be appropriate?
Thank you. We do have that letter, and we'll enter it into, do we have that letter? You mind giving? Read it out loud. Yeah, yeah. After, we'll submit this item into the record as item number 1. And what we'll do is, is there a motion to accept?
So moved.
There is a motion and a second. All those in favor? The ayes have it. The item is before us. And Larry, Mr.
So,
Mancini, would you?
Mr. Chairman, I will do my best to paraphrase it, given that it's the letter of Ms. Hawkins, but I do want to at least touch upon most of the items that she remembered. Again,
Sure.
Dated today and addressed to the committee members, she states that she's writing to follow up on the fiscal note that the administration received on February 18, 2026, related to the Providence Rent Stabilization Act. While we appreciate having the opportunity to review the first version of this note, there are outstanding assumptions and impacts that must be further detailed to understand the true financial impact on the city's finances. We've outlined these follow-up questions below in hopes that this will help your committee in its deliberations. She goes on to state that, as required by the city charter, the fiscal note must include detailed estimates of the fiscal implications of the ordinance. For this ordinance, these estimates should include 1, projected impacts of the tax levy, including any shift in tax burden across tax classifications, and 2, projected expenses to optionalize the components of the ordinance. And with respect, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, of the impacts to tax levy, I do have in my own testimony, I will go into detail, but allow me, if you will, the other concerns that she has expressed in her letter, and I'll only take another minute of your time to express that. In addition
you
to
may
impacts to the
take-
tax levy, she indicates that there are projected expenses to implement this ordinance, and they include, first, the current fiscal note does not include any projected estimates for the volume of appeals that the council is expected if implemented. This number is critical to ensure compliance with the required timelines. Given that determining if a property is rent stabilized, along with the complications in determining the allowable rent, would be in different circumstances, the council should consider several scenarios for the volume of potential appeals. The administration would expect a high number of appeals, especially in the first years of implementation. She goes on further to cite sections 1371, 1372, 1373, and 1373, all of which are assigned by city departments that will have additional burden associated with this ordinance. As an example, 1371, housing standards compliance. Who would be responsible for evaluating if a unit is following local and state housing codes for which enforcement is spread across multiple city and state agencies? There would be a burden to city staff. Section 1372 of the ordinance, major renovations and reconfigurations. Who is responsible for evaluating the technical components of this section? She goes on to state that this requires someone with construction experience to both evaluate the nature of the renovations and to establish if the cost associated with the work is fairly representative. The city staff are going to be expected to perform this function. If city staff is expected to perform this function, then allocations to those department budgets should be estimated. If a third-party cost estimator should be involved, that consultant fee must be included. Under Section 1373, how have you evaluated the staffing required to review the impact of tax increases on rental properties? During the most recent revaluation, nearly 100% of properties saw a tax increase of more than 5% on their properties. How would the board manage the approval process for thousands of potential rental increases in this scenario? And then again, on Section 1373, standard of review, fair return, who will be responsible for evaluating the completion of capital improvements, the condition of properties, and the code compliance. These components will require technical knowledge and skills. If city staff, once again, are going to be expected to perform this function, then allocations to those department budgets should be estimated. The fiscal note should also estimate the non-personnel related costs with particular attention to the following: technical expenses such as IT, space considerations for occupancy, and of course the legal costs associated with that. In summary, she writes, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, it is incredibly important that an accurate fiscal note is developed as part of the consideration of this ordinance. Without clear operational analysis and vetting, this ordinance is almost guaranteed to set up an expectation for constituents that cannot be fulfilled. The use of the para budget as a proxy for an estimate of this board's budget is not sufficient as the requirement of the two functions and are very different. And then finally, she states, Mr. Chairman, under Section 1385, Section E articulates that, quote, funds shall be sufficient to ensure full implementation of the board's duties, which creates a funding mandate not established on behalf of any other city department. She signs off sincerely, Courtney E. Hawkins, Chief Operating Officer. And with respect, Mr. Chairman, I have provided the clerk with several copies of this letter for the record.
Thank you. The letter has been received, and it's
Thank you.
in the record. And what we'll do also, for the purpose of this hearing and committee meeting, we'll read it into the record after you give your remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if I may continue in my own right, once again, good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I am Lawrence Mancini. I'm the city's Chief Financial Officer. I want to first start by stressing that the administration recognizes the seriousness of housing challenges facing residents in Providence. As you know, I attended the public hearing, and I sat through that hearing, and I did hear all of the testimony, and I was moved by that testimony in both ways, for the record. And I did that out of respect to the public, respect to the administration, and more importantly, respect to the city council, who I appeared before that evening as I appeared before this evening. So with that said, I wanted you to know that. Families across the city are struggling with rising rents and are a real shortage of available housing. Our departments work diligently every day to increase supply, to protect, preserve, and produce housing opportunities for residents. The urgency is real, and as evidenced by the administration's housing report, we share the goal of helping residents remain safely housed in our community. My role tonight is not to debate the intention behind this ordinance. My responsibility is to explain the financial risks, implementation challenges, and economic consequences the city must consider before adopting a policy that would permanently affect our municipal budget and tax structure. As I noted in the public hearing, the administration requested a fiscal analysis of the proposal on January 26th. The Finance Department received the fiscal note the day of the hearing, but it covers only some of the costs we have seen in other communities who have similar policies. The proposal establishes a residential rent regulation board with staff, legal support, and administrative oversight. The fiscal note estimates the annual operating cost at approximately $576,000 beginning next fiscal year and increasing in future years. This includes personnel, benefits, and operating expenses. This is not a one-time implementation cost. It is an ongoing structural obligation that would need to be funded every year through the city budget. This estimate does not include the work of additional departments to provide data, confirm ownership, and improvements, and was not developed in consultation with any of the administration's experts in those areas or departments. Administrative cost, however, is not the primary functional and financial concern. The more significant issue is the potential impact on Providence's tax base. Providence relies heavily on property taxes to fund basic municipal services. Property taxes represent roughly 42% of the city's total revenue in its budget. Approximately 60% of residential properties contain rental units, representing billions of dollars in assessed value. The ordinance directly affects that property class. Based on a preliminary analysis conducted by the Finance Department, approximately 44% of residential dwellings in Providence could be subject to the rent control provisions. Applying observed impacts from similar policies, the city could experience property tax revenue losses or shifts ranging approximately $1.9 million to $3.2 million annually. And under certain model conditions, the losses could approach between $10.3 million and $17.5 million. These projections do not include additional valuation impacts. In St. Paul, Minnesota, property values declined by approximately 4.4% following adoption of rent control. A similar reduction in Providence would further reduce tax revenue. It is important to understand that lost tax revenue does not disappear without consequence. The city must still fund schools, police, fire, public works, capital improvements, and importantly, snow removal, all within a very small discretionary budget. When revenue from one class of property declines, the tax burden shifts to others. In practice, that means higher tax rates for single-family homeowners and owner-occupied properties, including many seniors and longtime residents living on fixed incomes. The fiscal note itself acknowledges that limits on rent increases may affect property valuation and lead to assessment appeals and litigation. Even a modest decline in assessed values could reduce property tax collections in the first year, and the city would incur legal costs defending assessment challenges. Beyond fiscal risks, there are implementation and housing policy concerns. Rent stabilization does not freeze rents or reduce existing rents. It regulates the pace of future increases. Evidence from other jurisdictions urges caution. In St. Paul, Minnesota, strict rent control adopted in 2021 was followed by a dramatic reduction in new housing permits while rents continue to rise. This lost development activity has caused legislators to roll back many aspects of their policy. By contrast, nearby Minneapolis pursued zoning reforms to increase housing supply and experienced both increased construction and declining rents. Other cities have faced administrative complexity after adopting similar policies. Portland, Maine has experienced multi-year backlogs of exemption applications and appeals, as well as unclear administrative roles. The proposed vacancy control provisions may also produce unintended effects. When annual increases are capped, property owners are incentivized to take the maximum increase every year to keep pace with rising costs, effectively institutionalizing annual rent increases rather than moderating them. Research also indicates rent control policies often disproportionately benefit higher income households who are more likely to secure and remain in regulated units, while lower income residents remain vulnerable to displacement. Targeting programs such as rental assistance, eviction, defense, and housing stabilization efforts directly support those residents. This ordinance, as drafted, also includes provisions that could affect housing production. The 99-year deed restriction requirement would prevent many existing affordable developments from qualifying for exemption. Additionally, the proposed new construction exemption period does not align with standard mortgage underwriting terms, creating uncertainty for lenders and developers that is already impacting projects in the city's development pipeline. Providence cannot afford policies that reduce investment, delay new housing, or destabilize the tax base. This proposal represents a significant structural change to the city's revenue environment that clearly has not been taken into consideration. It introduces permanent administrative costs, potential legal exposure, and the possibility of multi-million-dollar impacts to municipal revenue. We all share the goal of keeping residents housed and making Providence affordable. But fiscal sustainability is also a form of protection. If we undermine the city's financial stability, we risk reducing services or shifting costs onto other residents, including the very households we are trying to help. Before moving forward, I respectfully urge the committee and the council to allow a full and transparent discussion with the administration and subject matter experts regarding the fiscal, legal, and economic impacts of this legislation. In closing, I want to emphasize that everyone here shares the same goal: keeping Providence residents housed and making our city affordable. The question before you tonight is not whether we should act, but whether this specific policy will achieve that without creating new problems. I want to thank you all for your time and consideration. This completes my testimony this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Mancini.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Would you like also to, us to have that and
You may.
submitted in
Yes.
on the record? Is there a motion? A motion to accept the item as number 2 has been second. Is there any other further discussion? It's accepted. Thank you. Questions from the committee to Mr. Larry Mancini? Councilwoman Shelley Peterson.
Thank you so much. Chief, thank you very much for being here and for providing your testimony
Thank you.
on this. I do have a quick question, potentially others, but one of the things that you had mentioned was that the financial department for the city ran a couple of different models and saw that there was the potential of the loss of tax revenue anywhere from 1.9 million to 3.2 million, and then in different models, it was 10 to 17 million. Would you be able to elaborate on some of what those models describe and how you got to those numbers?
I'd be glad to. So, Councilman, as I had said in the public hearing, and given that we were looking to establish some information prior to the public hearing, in the city of Portland, the now known model that we used, they do not use tax classification. So they used an all-in tax rate spread across the entire city to arrive at their calculation. Hence, if we were to do the same, we would arrive at the much larger differentiation between 10 and 17 million. If we could specifically identify, and the tax assessor's office did in fact do that by identifying how many single-family owner-occupied properties, multifamily rental properties do exist by their classification, and apply that same theory, when applied and not being able to further identify other owner-occupied or rental properties that could be affected by the ordinance, the results of that came up with a much smaller loss or shift of 1.2 million to 3.4 million. So to be clear about that, it was based upon doing it based on our specific identification, and then what if we were to do it under the model that existed in Portland, because they only have one tax classification, we have multiple tax classifications. Thank you.
That it? Thank you. Any further questions for now? Councilman Arroyas.
Thank you, Chair. Just had a few questions, Mr. Messini. What is the, can you just explain what exactly would be the unintended consequence, the driver of lost revenue? What is it about rent stabilization that drives a loss of revenue for the city?
So if there was a loss of revenue based upon the model that I just discussed with Councilwoman Peterson, it is a loss in that category that then becomes a shift to another category, and that shift most likely will be single-family homes.
What category? I'm sorry, just...
Category of owner-occupied rental property or multifamily, that would be a different classification, different tax rate. Valuations are different because of the property's use versus a single family. Once that valuation loss becomes a shift, the shift is made up elsewhere, and most likely would be in single-family homes.
I guess this is where I'm getting at. Why would, could you just address the impact of revals?
Correct.
Could you just, from the administration's perspective, how rent stabilization could impact revals and why?
Well, reval is based on market value, based on a certain measurement date.
Yep.
So with due respect to the last reval, as we saw the prices of values based upon sales activity, which is the comparable method that is generally used, if there was a decline in sales because there was less interest involved in becoming a non-owner occupied owner of a multifamily property, and therefore values slipped, property stayed on the market longer, it would show up in that reval, the next set of revaluation 3 years hence, that there was a smaller valuation. If there was empirical evidence to demonstrate that it was caused by a lack of confidence or a lack of interest in that market, that might show up in the reval, and hence it would show up in a revenue loss because the values have slipped.
Got it. And my second question here is, well, not really, I guess, a question, but I just want to call it out because I do think it's the perception that, because I've looked into this as well, when St. Paul, it was mentioned by the administration that construction permits dropped significantly in 2021. And what I've looked into is that rent stabilization at that time, the law went into effect in 2022. And the campaign for rent stabilization in St. Paul and you know, so there's also some sentiment around, well, there was a whispered campaign, and somehow homeowners found out that rent stabilization was coming, and so they pulled back on their permits. But Does the administration understand that the law took effect in 2022 and that at that time we had a labor shortage, we had, like the market was not favorable regionally, it was a regional impact because if you looked at other cities at that time, permits were also impacted regionally speaking. It was pretty much nationwide. Does the administration take that into consideration?
I believe we have, and I think the administration, while not taking a specific position on the interpretation of that data, and as the council president mentioned, the word of correlation when that occurs, and hearing from what you said this evening, so-called whisper campaign, whisper or otherwise, I think when there's talk about change in statutes, laws, or ordinances, I do think it builds some sort of momentum and maybe sensationalism that it might frighten the market, any market. And I don't mean to say that happened in St. Paul or what happened here in Providence, but that's generally a condition precedent that would occur that could, in fact, say, while that law has not taken effect yet, before it does, I'm not inclined to make any new investment. Therefore, I'm not willing to take out any permits associated with construction.
That's all, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll move forward, and then we'll have you there if we have some more questions along also with for the prime sponsor. One more question that just came up. All right, Councilwoman Peterson.
Because we're discussing how all of this, one of the questions that I have is there any data that shows other jurisdictions that have created some sort of rent stabilization opportunity in their municipality where a tax increase did happen on single-family homes?
If there is, Madam Councilman, I don't have access or possession of it, but I'm happy to review that and see if there is.
Please, that would be really important to
Yeah.
have. Thank you.
I'd be glad to do that.
Councilman Sanchez.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chief Mancini, for being here and always being available to answer questions. And of course, a lot of gratitude for you for staying the full 6 hours with us a couple weeks ago.
My pleasure, sir.
We truly appreciate it, and I know the people of Providence appreciate it. My question, Mancini, and I don't want to, beat around the bush, and I just kind of want to be direct as much as possible, always in a respectful manner with you, because that's always what you show us. Is there any possible amendments that we could make to our ordinance that still, have the full intent of stabilizing rents that the administration would support? Because there's just a full transparency. The mayor's been in opposition from this piece of legislation without even seeing a piece of legislation from a couple years ago, and obviously he is still opposing it right now. But just so the public understands, is there anything that we could do as a city council, the sponsors of this, to get to the administration to a point where they would support this piece of legislation?
So, Councilman, I hear that, and I wouldn't be the official spokesperson to supply the answer. I think that would probably amount to a policy considerations, and I think that is certainly a fair question, and if folks in policy, our policy chief would to look at that. Some of the provisions that included cost expenditures should be better vetted, I think, to arrive at what would that really look like should this become an ordinance into law. As to how to either improve, expand, or otherwise modify the current ordinance, I respectfully defer to the folks who know policy better than I do. Our role in finance is to provide impact information where necessary, but certainly happy to work with our policy folks and our folks in planning and housing to arrive at something.
Any follow-up on that? No, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councilman Royas?
Thank you. Actually, Councilor Sanchez reminded me I had another question for Mr. Mancini, and I forgot and I remembered. So bear with me. One of the, it sounds like preferred, I will say this sounds like a question for the policy team, but I do think it's relevant in your sort of scope of work, I think. There's a preference to provide sort of rental assistance, I'm assuming, or at least it was referenced that the city might be interested in providing rental assistance for tenants. Do you know if there's a number for that? How much that would cost the taxpayers, and who would be which department would be administering that, and how many? Because we're talking about the cost, the administrative cost of a rent board.
Right.
But I would imagine there's a significant cost to administer a rental assistance program through the city. There would be several, I'm sure, FTEs, and in my mind, a rental assistance program that would be effective for a housing crisis of this magnitude would probably be reaching in the millions. And it would go rather quickly. And so has the city talked about what, because I believe they're going to submit that with the budget. I don't know if you've heard any things about sort of the cost of that and how they would administer that program.
So while I'm aware of the phrase rental assistance being discussed, nothing solid has yet been presented to finance in order to give a deeper dive, but certainly if it does come before us, we will do the due diligence that we're always requested to do, and we will have that information.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Mancini, if you could just hang on.
Yes.
As we hear from our next invited guest, Tom Zagoros. So if you could provide us with an introduction and then speak on the item before you. We already have your letter and the fiscal note that you have provided. I would like to entertain a motion to accept the item. The motion has been moved and second. All those in favor? The ayes have it. It is before us. Welcome, Mr. Seguros. It's good to see you. It's been a long time since our
It has.
legislative days at the State House. So welcome.
It has. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak, and for the opportunity to submit my thoughts about the fiscal impact of this ordinance. I don't think it's necessary to read this, but I'd be happy to sort of step through it.
Yes, you may present it as you will.
Okay.
Obviously, it's before us, and I think that we as a committee have had it for a couple of days, and especially, a couple of weeks, especially during our marathon hearing the last time that we were here.
Yep.
So please, this is your time,
Okay.
and our committee members will also have some questions, some follow-up for perhaps yourself, and also some follow-up with Mr. Mancini, and then also from our prime sponsor, Council President Miller.
Sure,
Thank you.
I'd be happy to. Well, I guess first about me. My name's Tom Seguros. I live and grew up in Rhode Island. I have made at least part of my living for the last 40 years as an independent policy consultant. I have clients in multiple states. I've testified to legislatures in 6 states about public finance issues of one kind or another. And I was asked to look at the impacts here. Obviously, a 4% limit on the future rent increases could have an impact on the valuation of properties. I mean, this is the model that Mr. Mancini was referring to. The question is, what kinds of impacts would a limit on rent increases have to the potential buyer of an apartment building? And it's a little hard to tell, right? There's different models. He was talking about models that were used in Portland or models that were used in St. Paul, maybe. I forget the other. But basically what you're doing is you're trying to anticipate what is the potential impact on the value of a property. And in fact, if you have some property that, say you're imagining that it's going to pay off, that some apartment is going to pay off itself in 10 years because you're anticipating, say, 5% annual increases, but you're limited to 4%, that means that the property will pay off, instead of paying off in 10 years, it'll pay off in 10 years and 5 months. So you could say, well, that's around 5%, maybe. And so you could take that as a potential estimate of what kind of a hit there would be on property values. Now, this is This is, like other models, just an estimate. This is an estimate where you're trying to make plausible assumptions about what would happen, but you can't really be sure until it comes to a court or comes to a assessment hearing. And even then, you can't really be sure until there's enough market experience to know for sure. But we still can, it doesn't mean that we're powerless to make estimates. You can take these estimates and work with them to see what happens. So I took a 5% hit as my guess. So that's a third model relative to the other two. But the thing is that a 5% hit is, there's about 34,000 properties in the city that are residential use in some kind. That's about $19 billion in aggregate value. About 60% of those have some kind of rental in them, so now we're down to about $10 billion in value. If we are then considering which ones are covered by the ordinance, I used a number of 60%, but that's because I was looking to set a ceiling, right? I was trying to make an overestimate because I'm looking to maximize the impact on the city budget. And so if you guess 60%, that's about $6 billion worth of value for the city. That's $6 billion in value that could potentially be affected compared to the $38 billion of the total valuation of property in the city. So 5%, a 5% hit on that value would of course be significant. But I think at this point it's important to remember that assessments are not the way that the city supports its services. Assessments are the way that the city apportions the burden of paying for the city services. You know, the city sets the tax rates each year, and the city sets the tax rates according to the budget that's necessary to be met. So if the property value goes down over here, it'll be compensated over here. Because Providence has multiple rates, it is obviously possible for the city to short itself by not setting one rate high enough to actually meet the budget. But I assumed in this note that the city would not do that, and that a loss in value over here would simply be compensated by changing the rate to meet it. Now, because there are a collection of rates to change, the city council has some discretion about where exactly the burden of reallocation falls. But before we move on from that point, let's talk about what that burden actually is. So say it's $10 million. Say it winds up being $10 million. The city raises about $400 million every year in property taxes. So $10 million represents approximately 1/4 of 1%, right? And so what you're doing is you'd be taking 1/4 of 1% of the total tax burden currently paid for by 15% of the city's property and allocating it to the other 85% of the city's property. So those, I think, are the numbers to think about, that we're talking about reallocating 1/4 of 1% of the take. But that also is why I believe that in even the medium term or the long term, that the essential impact on the city's budget in terms of property tax revenue will be very small or negligible. To move on to the next thing, the question of services and how to staff the rent board. The ordinance before you is fairly clear about certain things. It's fairly clear about the percentage of rents, the percentage limits on rent. It's fairly clear about which properties are subject to it and which properties are not. And so my guess, and because the rent board is set up as a complaint-driven process, My guess, my assumption here, is that many possible cases will not be submitted to the rent board because they will be clear, because it will be clear to a property owner that this is not a rent increase that would actually pass at the board. So my guess is that the clarity of the language in the ordinance means that the nightmare scenario of the rent board being totally overwhelmed with appeals is less likely to happen. And that's why it seemed plausible to use an existing board like PERA as a model, that it seemed as if the rent board itself would require an executive director and an assistant, some legal help, and a case manager to do a certain amount of investigation. That is the assumption that powered this estimate. Beyond that, the next section, I talk about the economic impact, and this is, I think, relevant to some of the other things that came up. Just roughly guessing again, or making as informed estimates as we can. My estimate is that the aggregate rent collected in the city is somewhere in the neighborhood of somewhere between 1.1 and maybe 1.5 billion dollars a year. And I think that when people are just as an aside, I think that when people are talking about rent subsidies, that you should keep that number in mind, because for a rent subsidy to actually make a difference in the market, it would seem plausible that it should be some appreciable fraction of the rent that's paid. And so people should be thinking in terms of the rent being $1 billion. I mean, that's a lot of money. And so when people just sort of blithely talk about rent subsidies, I think it's important to sort of recalibrate those thoughts and think hard about what that actually means. On the excuse me, on the brighter side, I should also point out that renters as a class tend to be people who spend what they have. And so money saved on rent is likely not going to be money saved in a bank, but likely going to be money spent on other expenses. And that I think will have a certain amount of economic impact in the neighborhoods where in the neighborhoods of the city. I don't think that any that additional economic activity like that is actually capturable by the city's current tax structure. So it did not seem that the actual impact on the city would be anything more than negligible. I need, though, to end by, the next step is, maybe this isn't the end, but the next step is to go back to the property tax estimate. I do think that in the long term, that the effect on the property tax rolls will be negligible. But I do think that there is a significant risk in the near term. And the risk is basically that come June, when, say, the ordinance goes into effect, apartment owners will be able to appeal, if not to the assessor's office, to the courts, and say, oh, the ordinance here has affected my property value. And then they will have to make that argument to a court or to the assessor's office about what actually will be the impact. They will have a debate about the model to use, whether to use the one that I'm talking about or the ones that Mr. Mancini was talking about. How those things end up is really difficult to say. But if you think that half of the properties will appeal and succeed, and that a 5% reduction in value is what they will get, then it seems to me that you can count on around $1.5 million worth of impact in fiscal year 27, right? The upcoming fiscal year. Now, when the tax rates are set again next year, I think they will compensate for whatever loss of value there had been. But I do think that in the near term, in the upcoming fiscal year, there is a certain amount of risk to, and the risk would include both the lost property tax value and probably some legal costs as well. And I guess the last thing two other things I'd like to bring to your attention that are related. Mr. Mancini talked about the shift of burden to seniors and longtime residents, and I guess I would point out that seniors and longtime residents actually also live in rentals, and so that's a point I'd like you to keep in mind. There's probably much more to say about the stabilization ordinance itself, but I am going to confine my remarks to the impact on the city budget and leave it there. So thank you very much for the time. I'm happy to answer whatever questions the committee may have for me.
Thank you, Mr. Soros. Thanks for the presentation. Any questions from the committee? Councilwoman Shelley Peterson.
Thank you. Thank you very much for preparing this for us and being here to facilitate the conversation for the committee. I want to refer back to something that you had mentioned with regards to tax estimates. And my question isn't directed to you. It's actually now, again, back to the chief, because there's something that I think is very relevant in what you had said. Chief, one of the things that we often talk about, and we brought it up quite a bit in last year's reevaluation process. We all know that the values that are put forward are based on the sales prices or the sales that have happened in the city. And part of what we're hearing today is that in the short term, we could actually see something. But one of the things that I want to just understand a little bit more is we also have to prioritize when there's a drop in sales in the city, regardless of whether this ordinance is available or not, right? So can you tell me a little bit about what we have to do or what we've done in the past when the reevaluation of a property has actually come in significantly lower than where we were the year before or 2 years before?
Thank you, Councilwoman. And I'm glad you asked, because on your question, and I want to have, if I may, a follow-up on a discussion that Mr. Segoras made about tax rates. And as we both acknowledge, loss also equals shift, which is really, the word is redistribute. So to Councilwoman Peterson's question, that's the crux of it. Each city budget, when next reviewed for the following fiscal year, becomes the base for that year going forward. In a year of rising values caused by a reval, not just a value that went up because of market value, the city assessors team always uses the process known as tax equalization. We've had this discussion many times before the council, and I see the heads nodding because it is the correct methodology. You lower the tax rates equal to the new higher values, if there are higher values, to return back to the base revenue that was certified in the last levy. That's the process of tax equalization. Then from there, pardon the expression, you grow the budget to meet the needs of the budget's increase, whether it's salary and wage increases, medical insurance, because we're self-insured, pension contributions, and such. And ideally, you hope that there was enough growth in the increases when captured at now a modified, hopefully lower rate, to support the budget. What you saw last year, caused by the impact of a agreed-upon settlement, forced the city, and the council was active in those discussions, to the point where you even modeled your own model, arriving at a new lower rate, lower than even the single-family home. And that was designed to give, in some cases, you hope, tax relief to a owner-occupied multifamily property that would ideally stabilize their rents increases or pass it along to their tenants. In that regard, when there is a loss of revenue in any category, it does cause an automatic redistribution. The revenue has to be made up somewhere. You have to begin at base value before you can even begin to grow the levy, if you do grow it, year over year. This exercise is not profound, and quite frankly, it is the backbone and the basis of city budgeting. 2/3 of the city's revenue is based on tax revenue, no doubt. Where relief can be given and granted, we have done that. We have increased the size of our exemptions to seniors and others, veterans. I think you all could appreciate that. You participate in those discussions. But our concern is the unidentified, unknown, yet to be determined loss of real value, and where does it get made up? It will have to shift. It will have to be made up somewhere if you intend on continuing with a base budget of the year prior before you move to the next year. And I hope I've answered your question. Thank you.
Any other questions? So I have a couple of questions or clarification.
Sure.
I know Mr. Mancini and many people refer to this piece of legislation or ordinance as rent control.
Correct.
And even in your remarks, you started off with rent control, and then shifted over into rent stabilization. So I guess this goes to both of you. What is your version of rent control or rent stabilization? And the second one is, seeing that this piece of ordinance that is different than the other pieces of legislation that have been enacted in cities such as Maine and Minnesota, how do they compare?
So if I may, before Mr. Segoras, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, while that term is not meant to be used loosely and interchangeably, clearly the act is known as stabilization. And so first and foremost, I believe it would be the act of the city as a city corporate government to provide some degree of stabilization to rising rents. But to do that, that requires a control feature. If that control feature is some rental board or some other mechanism that does that, permit me, if you will, but pardon me also, that they're not meant to, in fact, leave any negative connotation where, in fact, they were used liberally, if you will, to describe what the action may take. In order to achieve stabilization, there may need to be certain controls associated with that process.
Would you like to take that? Go, Mr. Segaros?
Sure. I would say that rent stabilization is a form of price control. We are, I think, all familiar with price controls in many different contexts of our economy. The state controls prices in insurance, in taxi cabs, in cigarettes, all kinds of things. The federal government controls prices of interest rates, drug prices. I mean, there are all kinds of price controls that we take for granted. Rent stabilization is not the same as rent control. It is, as I alluded to when I was talking about the potential administrative burden, it's a much simpler kind of a thing to do, but it is still a form of price control. The thing that I find notable about price controls is that none of those controls, insurance, banking, whatever, none of those controls were put into place because some economists thought that theory predicted it would be a good idea, right? All of those things were put into place because people perceived an emergency. People perceived a problem. You know, there was insurance scandals. There were banking crises. There were gas price issues. I mean, all of these controls were put into place because, for one reason or another, the free market did not work, and these price controls were enacted because of that problem. And I think that it's remarkable that some of these things are unremarkable. You know, that they have been part of our lives for so long that, insurance regulation is a fascinating example. It was something that happened in the latter part of the 19th century when the city of Chicago burnt down and only about 20% of the insurance policies actually paid off. And somebody said, oh, maybe we should regulate the prices of insurance so that the insurance policies actually mean something, right? The banking industry was racked by scandals all through the 1910s and 1920s, and we came up with bank regulation to try to prevent that from happening in the future. These are, the price controls that we take for granted are just a simple part of the history that has taught us that sometimes there is a place to stand in for government to step in and assert some form of control over prices. You can debate about how to, how best to do that. What's the lightest touch that you need to actually enact realistic change? But I think that these are, these are what you find when you try to learn from our nation's economic history.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question, and I'll call my colleague. The other, during the hearing, one thing that stuck out to me was that, and I've always asked this in a sense, do we have, obviously, and you both deal with numbers, and people have always said numbers don't lie, but in government and other entities, people interpret it differently, or they, as you pointed out, even though the numbers may say that may not be the best idea to go to do certain things, go ahead and we try it. One of the testimony, and we know that we have a housing crisis and we have a rental crisis in the city of Providence. One of the testimony was given that it would take decades for us to create the number of units for the city of Providence to catch up. And it was just, the number was I think it was like 90 years or something like that. I want to hear what is that number from you, if there is a number. How many years would we need to get those units online and therefore impacting the rental impact on the residents of Providence, in your opinion?
So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, members of the council, while I'm aware of that testimony or something to that effect was given, I certainly would not be the content knowledge expert in that area, but practicality suggests that once you identify the number of underdeveloped units that exist, whatever that number is, to support a city the size of Providence and its unhoused needs or its needs to stabilize housing, then it goes by product availability, construction timeline, construction labor availability, and how many units can be produced within regulations that are safe and viable housing. And I'm certainly not the expert in that area, but one could guess that that's the proximate way of approaching how long would it take to build another supply of housing, whether it's 100 or 1,000, and that would determine that. But I certainly think that can be obtained once you know the basics of that, something estimate on that.
Similarly, I think I would have to defer the question to people who know more about what the capacity is of private investors and what the capacity is of the city, for example, to streamline things like permitting. But I guess what I would leave you with is what the market does well. What markets do well is provide price signals that allow every seller to find a buyer, right? People who have something to sell, you bring it to the market. If there are too many buyers, the price goes up. If there are not enough buyers, the price goes down. The mechanism of supply and demand is essentially the mechanism that allows every seller to find a buyer. The problem that you face, that we all face, is that that's not what we want in the housing market. I mean, we want every seller to find a buyer, but more important, we want every buyer to be able to find a seller. And that is actually not what uncontrolled markets do. And that's something that the world has struggled with for, for a number of years. There are not really excellent answers for how you get there, but it is fairly clear that the market left alone does essentially the opposite of what you need for a safe and well-housed population, where you need all the buyers to be able to find an appropriate seller.
Councilman Arroyos has a question.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to try to ask both of you to respond to this feedback loop in my brain, so bear with me. There is, which I actually subscribe to, there is a view that increased supply of housing would bring down the prices of rent. I generally agree with that. I guess also in my brain, I'm wondering if there's a few drivers to home values. I think supply is a big driver. Also rental income. I mean, what a landlord could charge for rent. And I think the view is that rent stabilization would bring down home values because landlords would be, in theory, prevented from ROIs, a sufficient rate of return on their investment. So I guess the questions I have in my mind is, if we as a city increase the housing stock and it's sufficient enough to meet demand in theory, right? Because I don't think it's going to happen overnight. And once we've increased the supply, therefore bringing down rents, and I say this because I know the administration's stance is we need to increase supply. I think everyone here agrees. But wouldn't that also impact home values? So what if we've increased the supply to such an extent where we need it to be, to get ourselves out of this housing crisis, wouldn't home values stabilize or drop?
If I may, so I believe it would do the opposite. Increasing the supply would add additional units of housing, therefore housing stock would add more value to the tax levy, even if the existing properties, along with the new additions, saw a lower market price because the demand for rental price has now shifted downward because landlords would have a harder time getting a higher rent because there are plenty of units available that the tenant renter could be a little more choosy about that, if you will, in any neighborhood. So to your point, I do think, despite the fact that it could have an overall impact on all values declining, there would be more properties to sustain new value that would support that. I do think that that's somewhat unofficial, but I do think that would be the case.
I would agree with Mr. Mancini that increase in supply would almost certainly increase the value of properties on the tax rolls, make it spreading that burden more broadly to more owners. And I agree too that it would the owner of an individual property would see the value of their property decline, as you say, because of the rents, because of the potential decline in rents that they would see, and so to some extent, I think that might have the same impact on those owners as the rent stabilization ordinance would.
Any further questions? My colleagues, any questions from our panelists? Thank you very much for your presentation, Mrs. Socorros. I'm sure that if we have any further questions from this committee, we'll reach out to you.
Okay.
Really appreciate your thoroughness within this fiscal note. Thank you for being here. Mr. Larry Mancini, thank you once again, and we'll continue to follow up with you and the policy department. As we've stated before, this is very challenging
No doubt.
times that we're living, and you recognize that. We all recognize that. We'll continue to hear from the public. This bill is not perfect, but we'll continue to ask the questions. And I really appreciate you and your staff digging in on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Madam President, members of the council. Appreciate being here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. At this time, we would just bring out any comments or any questions that we may have, perhaps of even the prime sponsor. If she would like, as she said, she'll be available to have, for us to deliberate, and so far what we have. As we continue to dig deeper on this issue of the rent stabilization, and to make sure that it's very transparent and very open to the public to ensure that their voices are heard. Many of the issues that we brought and are put before us, not all city council members think alike, or maybe in the same page, or supporting this bill. But we ensure that as we go forward with any piece of ordinance or legislation, we give the opportunity for the question and answers, and that we are also available to meet with constituents, but also with our main sponsors. So at this time, Councilwoman Shelley Peterson, yes.
I guess I'm going first. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I know that I've individually talked with Council President and some of the supporters and sponsors of this bill as is, and I've also talked quite a bit to renters in my neighborhood, organizations that are actively in support or opposed, and landlords as well. I speak from the position of continuing to remain undecided, and there's a variety of reasons for it. And I want to be very clear that undecided does not mean not supportive or opposed. There's a lot of implications as written that this potentially imposes on the ward, and I want to make sure that those are put on record in this conversation. There's a lot of nuance to what we're trying to do here, and I do want to say, before I get into the nitty-gritty of what I'm trying to speak on, I don't think any of us can deny the fact that there is an affordability crisis in our city. Hands down, that is probably number one when we're continuing to talk with our neighbors about what's going on. I live in a neighborhood, and I represent a neighborhood that has been consistently gentrified by student housing, which is not housing that is supportive of families in the neighborhood. My neighborhood has been pretty consistently, street by street, for lack of a better word, gentrified into something that is not something to support family living or even opportunity for families to thrive in our neighborhood. The areas of Smith Hill and Elmhurst and Wanskuck have been pretty consistently purchased, the properties have been purchased for student housing because there's a college that resides right in the middle of where the ward is. Now, as written, one of my concerns is the exemption component of this, where new construction has the opportunity for exemption up to 15 years. And I understand all of the reasons why we should do it. I'm aware and I'm supportive. However, in Ward 14, as the business models run, this would actually hurt. We have large corporate landlords that have pretty consistently taken a lot of the multifamily units, non-owner occupied multifamily units in our neighborhood. And the business model is very proactively purchasing a single family home to then knock it down, to then put up a multifamily unit that is not going to build affordable housing. It's not going to build family housing. It's not going to anything that we see as something that is outside of the benefit of receiving tax benefit from it. It's not supporting the community in any other way. And that's a real concern for me because the business model is literally to knock down and build something bigger. We have seen that some of these corporate landlords make approximately $1 million a month just on the properties that they have in my ward alone. And as the business model continues to maintain itself that way, we would see, and we've seen, because this is continuing to happen even as we speak, that they would take the opportunity to do exactly to maintain their business model, and they can because they have the resources to do so. So, you know, I'm an advocate of trying to regulate in some capacity what we can do to help stabilize our city, the affordability that we have here. I am absolutely supportive. What I don't understand, what I don't believe that this would do, specifically in my ward, would be to help in that way. I think that what it would do would be to continue the business as usual model that's happening in Ward 14, and we'd see a lot more properties go because they're able to afford a much higher value, a much higher purchase price to owners in the neighborhood. And you know, for a variety of reasons, our neighbors are leaving, whether it's affordability, whether it's not wanting to deal with the quality of life issues that come with living abutting student housing. And those are very real implications for the neighbors in my ward. The other part of this, and this is a much more holistic piece of what where I'm trying to go with this, is that while stability is important, affordability is important, those are key things that we should be focusing on all the time for our city and our residents. I think that we have so much more to do as a city to be able to create affordability as a whole for our neighbors. The reality is that our businesses are closing left and right, and the gig economy that so many of our constituents and our residents utilize to be able to sustain themselves, it's faltering. Our restaurants are closing left and right, our bars are closing left and right, and while we can tout that we've been successful in certain ways, we can see that the vitality of our small businesses is decimated in many of our neighborhoods. And I will, again, raise my hand and say that in Ward 14, you don't have as much of a thriving small business economy as you do in other locations. And so that's a very real thing that we need to be doing, not just to be able to rent. This ordinance is just a small piece of, in general, what I think we need to be doing to support our neighbors. It has so much more to do with mobilizing multiple pieces for neighbors, whether they're in affordable housing currently, looking to save to buy that first home in the city, or trying to maintain so that they don't, trying to maintain the rent that they have, so and hopefully be able to stay in there the next coming year. It's really important that we start utilizing our space, this chamber, to actively recognize that this is not just, this is not the end-all, fix-all of what's going to happen in the city or what the city needs. Our neighbors are leaving, the families are leaving the city for a variety of reasons, and the number one is because it's not affordable anymore. So it's not just a rental, a housing issue, it's an economy issue, it's a development issue, it's a workforce opportunity issue, and we really need to focus in on highlighting that those are things that need to get done as well. And this is, the last one that I have is also kind of is a part of this continued conversation. And that in addition to all of the things that I've just talked about, The other component to all of this, for me, revolves around the smaller landlord that I want to make sure that we are able to maintain. It kind of goes back to the first point that I was making earlier, is that in my neighborhood, and I'll give you just a very perfect example, the last house that sold in a student housing, and I say this because it's very important to highlight that, this point. At the end of January, there was a home that was sold for $930,000. I'm sorry, $950,000. It was a 1,200 square foot home with it's 1.5 lots. It's right in a central location where they're trying to continue to expand student housing, but a family trying to move into the city could absolutely never afford $950,000. You know, this is something that the corporate landlords in my neighborhood are well aware of. They can afford to give these higher values to people that are trying to sell. And I do genuinely worry about the smaller landlord that really just maintains their 1 or 2 properties to be able to sustain their opportunity for generational wealth or whatever it might be. But they are also preyed on by these larger corporate landlords that continue to do a lot of this. And that's an important thing to highlight as well. I think a lot of the conversation and the narrative around what we're doing here often comes into this very black and white. You're a homeowner and you're a landlord, so you have a lot more opportunity than somebody else does. And I think by right, there's an opportunity to have a conversation here about just how much it does actually cost to be a landlord. I remember a landlord locally was telling me that to renovate his unit, it was going to cost him $27,000. And that's a very real implication as to what they actually could put forward as their increase for their property when coming in front of the rent board. So there's a lot of things here that I still think that we need to really understand, and it's the reason why I've been adamant about making sure that people are aware of the reasons why staying neutral until we find a way to answer a lot of these questions, not only for our renters but also for our landlords, is really important. I'll stop there because I could keep going forever and ever and ever. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilman Sanchez?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just, I guess, a question for you first, Chairman. Before we continue, is the purpose of this meeting to each of us just put out our individual thoughts, or is the purpose to have like a conversation? So, I'm asking because Councilwoman Peterson brought up some good points, but I would have some like clarifying questions for like some of her comments. So is the purpose to like have a healthy dialogue in between us as a committee, or just for us to go down our bullet points and share those concerns, comments, questions?
Yeah, I mean, the purpose of this meeting was to hear from the panelists that we invited, obviously the main sponsor if you had any questions, but also just reflecting on the testimony that we received, and if you had any clarification that you needed to ask the panelists to do so. We will continue to have these dialogues among one another, but at the same time, we're going to have 2 more additional listening sessions. And in addition, once we also provide amendments to this, then we can really have another public hearing and most likely go on to hopefully answer most of the questions that we may have, and then to be able to do so. But if you want to do that, that'd be great.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, very healthy dialogue. I guess like the question would go to the primary sponsor. As you mentioned, Council President, at the beginning, the intention around this ordinance is to stabilize future rents. In your opinion, because I'll just say, first of all, I don't envy any of my colleagues that represent any major like student housing areas, because that is a difficult task for many reasons. But I just don't see this ordinance necessarily addressing any student housing concerns, because that's not the intention, unless I'm misunderstood. Is there anything that we could do in this ordinance to maybe address some of the student housing concerns? And yeah, of course, it's...
To be fair, and to be completely fair, neither landlord that well, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. Both of the landlords the biggest landlords in my particular neighborhood, one does exclusive student housing, the other one does not. So the implication of, yes, we have, and just so for transparency, I have put forward several student housing policies aimed at trying to
Which I fully support.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Aimed at trying to rectify the decades-old issues of the continuing expansion of what it is. But there's, with everything, it takes time. We wanted to be very community-focused when we did the work to create those policies. And we're going to be able to see the remaining few in the next few months. So one of them, yes, fully exclusive. The other one, some student housing, but not everything. So when I talk about what it means is in my specific ward, some of the landlords that are there are not just building for that. Either way, I don't necessarily know that I kind of agree with them to have market rate after 15 years. Like they're gonna be able to continue their same business model, and that doesn't help the ward that I'm trying to represent.
So, I mean, just lastly, I don't know if the sponsor has anything to add. Obviously, more than welcome. But the point I was trying to get to is I don't think there's anything that we could do in this ordinance that's enacting rent stabilization citywide to unfortunately stop the problem that you're bringing up, which is it as a problem. I think it's very important to validate that, but just trying to like loop us back in the full intention, and that's the honest reality that we have to share, that we have been sharing with our constituents and continue to share. That is unfortunately, while we do appreciate the community organizing around freezing rents, that's not something in our legal authority or constitution. What we can do is having the conversation that we're having now, and that's stabilizing future rents going forward.
Thank you, Councilman.
If I could continue with my regular remarks.
Okay, I thought you were.
Before we continue.
Yeah, and I would encourage also individually, if you have any other questions to the sponsor, but also us, to have those conversations so that way, as we have those listening sessions, that we can propose or come forward with how to best improve this ordinance. Yeah. Again, we keep saying that it's a unique ordinance. That's why I asked the question in terms of, can you compare with other states? I think we're going forward with something that is need-based in our city, and so I would encourage that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Obviously, a little biased, but I'll definitely give a huge shout out to our policy team, Aaron, especially our Deputy Policy Director, Miguel. I have read a lot of different rent stabilization ordinances across the world, not just the U.S., and I think ours definitely, the way we're starting it off is one of the most comprehensive, detail-oriented, thought-out rent stabilization ordinances that has ever come across a public body. And this is just saying it as a starting point. Obviously, we're taking feedback and amendments, but a lot of the questions that have been raised so far, or some of the talking points that our friend AI brings up are addressed in this ordinance, and I think that's a huge first step while we open up this conversation. And then secondly, what I always do or try to do when talking about legislation, and especially this piece of legislation, is ground it back to the human standpoint or the human starting point. And you know, we talk about cost, the finances, which is obviously very important. But the cost of not addressing the crisis is human lives. And I don't think we'll ever put a dollar amount on a human life here in Providence as elected officials. And I mean, we've all seen it for the past few winters. Our neighbors are literally freezing to death. And while enacting this stabilization ordinance might not prevent a Providence resident from ever freezing to death, it's definitely going to move us in the right direction to minimize that reality. It's been said, I mean, even one of my colleagues mentioned a lot of the things that we have been doing to encourage development and supply when we first introduced it. And even so, I mean, this is something we've all been honest about, is that this is a multi-pronged approach, and the reality is it's going to be a few more years until we actually create a city that allows our residents to live in dignity. And I mean, we talk about different challenges and, you know, some of the harsh crises that a lot of our residents live in. There isn't one greater than not having a safe, warm, affordable roof over our head. And while that's something we all agree on, and there's not one person in this room that currently doesn't have that. And that's something we have to remind ourselves. All of us in these seats, you know, obviously we come from different backgrounds. You know, a lot of us have inspiring stories and, you know, hardships that we have overcome. But where we are right now is completely different from the reality of a lot of our neighbors. And the voices that I try to elevate and bring to these spaces, because unfortunately a lot of them don't have the privilege to do so. So lastly, I mean, I'm just so glad that we're having this dialogue in a public body for the first time ever. I think that's a huge first step. And I encourage to folks to continue having these dialogues, because I, you know, am proud of being a co-sponsor and introducing it and getting us to this point, but I really put myself aside. I could care less of having, you know, my name attached to something. What I truly want at the end of the day is, you know, I'm 27 years old right now. I want to be 35, 37, look back or look outside and live in a Providence that folks are able to call home, especially folks that have called Providence home for decades. Because that's the harsh reality is that a lot of families that, you know, have been here, that have called Providence home, are being displaced, and that's happening on a daily basis in our city. And we have the opportunity to add another tool. You know, we all say we have multiple tools in the toolbox, and that's what this is. This is another tool to create a city that is for everyone. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, agreed. Councilman Royas, and
Chair, thank you. I just, some thoughts that are swirling in my mind here that I've been hearing from all types of folks, renters and landlords. I think that one central point I want to address publicly is the right of fair return. And I guess I want to say this again to the folks out there who are listening. Every cost that a landlord has to take on, whether it's through maintenance, increases, home repairs, utility increases, property tax increases. That is all accounted for in this ordinance. The only difference that we're asking is for you to stand before a board and show proof of that increase. And I think that's where the friction lies, is that folks call a rent board anti-American. And I happen to think it's actually a very democratic tool. You look at every other industry, it's regulated. Utility companies have to go before the state's PUC to get rates approved. They have to be fair and reasonable. I would argue whenever Rhode Island Energy increases utility rates, it's not fair and reasonable, but that's another point. But they have to go before a board to get approval. Kind of zooming out, I would also say that homeowners in Providence have rent stabilization right now. It's called the levy. Cities and towns cannot raise the levy unless there's an appeal past 4%. And so renters don't have that option. And so I would just leave everyone with those two thoughts.
Thank you very much. Council President, would you like to say a few words?
No, I just will say, well, one, I do think there's likely a path to talk directly about student housing and make sure that it's not being impacted in a way. So yes, apparently I do have something to say. But mostly I just want to thank you all so much for the earnest conversation and the nice start to the public process here. Thank you.
Thank you. As we conclude, I just want to emphasize to those who have continuously worked on this. We've been talking about this for almost 2 years, and especially for me, it's policy. It's also very personal, as Councilman Sanchez just indicated, growing up here. But I also know what rent control is when we look at New York and other places. And those type of rent controls is very difficult, and I wouldn't be in favor of those. But I think what's important is that as I have grown up here, now being a grandfather, is to see what kind of Providence we're actually building. This is for a generation. And how a 27-year-old looking forward to when he's 35 and has a couple of kids, is he going to be able to live here? That's the question that I have for my grandchildren and even for my kids. I think that those of us who continue to develop policy or legislation, especially here in the city of Providence, we get to see, those who have been involved, how through a system sometimes the public doesn't get too much input into it. This is unique, and more so over the years. And I am privileged to serve with so many people that are passionate, from the policy, from the policy office, from the administration, that we all can agree that we're going through harsh economic challenges in our city, needing more housing, needing more affordability for our city. And so I ask again, those who are here, but also that are hearing our message, is that you still have an opportunity to write to us, to read the piece of legislation on the rent stabilization, and know the difference between rent control and rent stabilization. They could go to our website, citycouncil.providenceri.org, and .gov. I'll repeat that, council.providenceri.gov, to ensure that your voice is heard. We're going to continue to hear from our constituency. I'll share with you that the next time we're going to be, there's 2 more listening sessions, which is March 11th at 5:30 at the Southside listening session at the Southside Cultural Center. Myself and Councilwoman Mary Kay Harris. And then the other one is March 18th at 6 p.m. at the Federal Hill a West End listening session at the Bell Street Chapel, and that will be by President Rachel Miller. And we will continue to look at what other amendments we can put into this. This will be a unique rent stabilization ordinance that is very flexible to ensure that it is another tool that we can have at the City of Providence. And I encourage my colleagues to talk to one another and see how we can improve this along with our policy team. So without any further comments, I'd like a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Just kidding.
Oh, can you make the motion to continue?
Do I have to? Oh, I'll make the motion to continue.
There is a motion to continue. Is there a second? Seconded by Councilman Sanchez. Any discussion? All those in favor? Aye. The motion carries. Meeting continues.